John the Baptist is such a fascinating character, and he is a man of contradictions. His father was Zechariah, the high priest who worked in the temple. I mean, he was the one who went into, when it was his turn, he would be the one that would go in once a year into the Holy of Holies, that most sacred of places. So John came from a heritage of religious importance, right? His household was one where the law was observed and the Torah was taught. It was a part of his upbringing, and he was Jesus's cousin. And, Mary went and visited John's mother at that time when they were both pregnant. So this is the story. This is Jesus' cousin, and he's there in the wilderness, and he is proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And it goes on to tell us more about John and his challenge to the people. But what I want to focus on today is this idea that John, basically, the priest's kid, right? The royalty of the temple, so to speak, didn't do his work in the temple. He didn't even go to the local synagogue. He went to the wilderness. So I want to ask the question, what is the wilderness? Now, there's a motif, a story that repeats throughout the Old Testament and the Psalms, and even in we even recount it in our Eucharistic prayer, and that is the story of God sending Moses to lead the people out of bondage, out of slavery and suffering in Egypt, through the Red Sea, escaping from Pharaoh's army, and into the wilderness. And there in the wilderness, God was with them. It was in the wilderness that they learned how to be God's people. It was in the wilderness that they received the law. Moses went to the top of the mountain, and then God gave Moses the law, and he brought it down to the people. And of course, it didn't go so well. There were lots of problems in the wilderness. There was lots of grumbling and complaining. There were idols that were made, and it was a difficult time. But then, eventually, Joshua led the people across the Jordan River and into the Promised Land. That's Israel and Judah. That's the Promised Land. That's where Jerusalem is. That's where the temple is. And John, this prophet, instead of going to the temple to proclaim his word, to proclaim the message that he brings to the people of God, he goes to the Jordan River, that border between the Promised Land and the wilderness. And there, as it says, in the wilderness, he proclaims a baptism of repentance and says, the kingdom of God has drawn near. In the wilderness. Now, we have lots of ideas about what wilderness is. Maybe you think of wilderness as a dangerous place full of wild animals and dangers. This morning, when I had this conversation with the people who were at our 8 o'clock service, they said that for some of them, the wilderness is very strongly identified with the desert and getting away from society. And, like the desert mothers and desert fathers, those early monastics who withdrew from society in order to focus on their faith in God more purely. But the image of wilderness that I want to focus on today is the one that comes right out of that story of the salvation of God's people. Moses led them through the Red Sea into the wilderness, and for 40 years they struggled. They tried to survive in the wilderness until God finally led them into the Promised Land. So the wilderness is where we go after we have been saved. And interestingly, what is the first thing that Jesus does after John baptizes him? He goes into the wilderness and fasts for 40 days and then is tempted by the devil. That's the wilderness. So I want to tell a wilderness story today. I want to draw a parallel between that life that the people of Israel were leading. Now remember, this is a whole lot of years after Joshua led them across and into the Jordan and into the promised land. They've had the rise of a wonderful kingdom under David and Solomon, and the fall of that wonderful kingdom with the exile of Babylon and the exile of the Assyrians and now the occupation of Rome. So the promised land has become a complicated and difficult place to be. In fact, maybe the promised land, the place that God led them to, has become so conflicted that it's more like the wilderness than the wilderness was. And so it's into the wilderness that John comes to proclaim this word. And I would argue that that's the condition that we are living in. We have been saved. We have the good news of Jesus. We have the good news that God is love and that God's love is meant for us and that we are meant to both receive that love and to live in that love and share it with others. And yet, it feels more like wilderness when we look around ourselves at the struggles of life, at the suffering of life, at the losses and the conflicts and the divisions of life. So, is God really with us in the wilderness? There's an old joke that I like, and there's a flood warning, there's a storm warning, and the radio announces that there's a storm on its way, and most of this fellow and most of his neighbors get up and they're leaving, and they say, "Hey, Joe, don't you think you should get ready to evacuate? There's a big flood coming with this storm." And he says, "No, I trust in God. God will save me." And the storm comes, and the winds are strong, and the rains are falling hard, and a truck comes in, and it's the evacuation workers, and they say to Joe, "Joe, get in the truck. You've got to leave. It's going to be too dangerous to stay here." And he says, "No, I trust in God. God will save me." And the truck drives off. And the rains fall, and the waters come up, the storm surge comes, and now his front yard is full of water, and he's standing on his tiptoes on his front doorstep, and a canoe comes by, and it's more evacuation workers, and they say to him, "Joe, get in the canoe. It's too dangerous to stay here." He says, "No, have faith. I trust in God." And the water keeps coming up, and so Joe gets out his ladder and he climbs onto the roof of his house, and he's huddled on the roof of his house, and the winds are blowing and the water's rising, and he can feel his house starting to shake as the water pushes through his house. And a helicopter comes, and the helicopter with its loudspeaker says, "Joe, we're going to lower you a rope. Let us pull you up into the helicopter." And he says, "No, don't worry about it. God will take care of me." And his house is blown off of is washed off of its foundation, and Joe falls into the water, and he drowns, and he dies. And there he is at the pearly gates, and he's there, and he's very confused, and he steps through the pearly gates into heaven, and there's God, and he says, "God, I trusted in you. Why didn't you save me?" And God looks at him, and he says, "What are you talking about? I sent you a truck and a canoe and a helicopter. You got to work with me here." So on Tuesday night, the severe weather emergency shelter was operating, and that was the first night of this cold. It was very cold, and it was that was when the snow started coming down, and everything was freezing. It was quite treacherous out, and there was that windstorm, and we had several large branches and trees come down in our property, and one of those branches was probably 30 feet, 40 feet long. It was huge, and it fell in this corner over here onto the main wire that comes into the church. And so at about 11:30 at night, the severe weather shelter lost all power. And there were we have 3 circuits that come into the building, and 2 of the 3 were out. So there was like 1 light here and 1 plug there that worked, but the furnaces were out. It was really difficult. So the next day, we came and we looked at the property, and there was a huge alder tree. It must have been 40 feet tall, that had fallen from the embankment on the far west side of the parking lot all the way across the parking lot up at the north end, and into the east, the other half of the parking lot. It was that big. And there were trees all over the place, and the power was out. We didn't end up being able to open on Wednesday night because we couldn't get the power back on. They didn't get here. There were so many outages. They just didn't get here. Eventually, Chris Johns and I decided, well, we're going to do what we can. And Chris and one electrician came, and he took the branch off of the high power lines out here, but it still didn't work. And so we had to wait for the big crew with the big trucks to come. And Chris and I decided that what we would do is see what we could do about that tree. Well, this was a big tree. The base of the tree is about this big around, you know. It's really large, and it had fallen from a hillside down to the parking lot and then broken in half. And so half of the tree, maybe 20 feet of it, was, you know, leaning. You could walk under it, and the other half was broken and on the ground. So I borrowed an electric chainsaw and a bow saw, and Chris and I were out there chopping up branches and hauling them into the corner to get them out of the way. And we both looked at the big piece of the tree and thought, what are we going to do? I don't even know how to cut a tree that big, and I don't even know if this little 4-horsepower electric chainsaw is strong enough, and it wasn't. It barely would cut through the main parts of the main parts of the trunk. It did great on the branches. So we're there, and we're working, and we're, you know, working away with this chainsaw, and the trucks arrive. 4 or 5 huge trucks, including this giant orange thing with a boom that could go hundreds of feet into the air. And there were 7 guys, and 2 of them were in the bucket fixing the power, and 2 of them were on the ground guiding them, making sure they didn't run the bucket into a tree or a power line. And the other 3 were standing around. Now, these guys had been working hard at this point. It was more than 36 hours since the power had started going out. And I was thanking them for being there. And I explained to them that by getting the power running, the emergency shelter would be able to open again. And I thanked them, and I blessed them for that. And then Chris and I went back to sort of pulling on the branches of this tree. And one of the guys walks up to me and he says, "Would you like a little help with that?" So I said, yes. And he goes to that great big orange truck, and he pulls out this great big chainsaw. You know, he goes up, and in like 10 minutes had just chopped the entire tree into 7-foot lengths. And it was amazing. It was wonderful. I couldn't believe how fortunate we were, because I did not know how to do that. And I'm sure that our little chainsaw wasn't going to do it. So Chris and I decided that we could pull those pieces, now that it was cut into 7-foot pieces, with my little pickup truck. And little is the operative word here. It doesn't even have a trailer hitch on it, but we thought the bumper's probably strong enough, and we'll tie it to. And so we're sitting there, and we're trying to figure out how to attach this to my truck without breaking the truck. And this great big pickup truck pulls into the parking lot. And it was like a 1985 planetary destroyer, you know, the 4 great big oversized wheels and the front hubs that, you know, the old-fashioned kind of 4-wheel drive where you have to lock the front hubs, and then it goes into low super power mode. And this big guy gets out, and he walks up, and it's one of the foundry workers from the foundry that makes the plaques for us. And he was delivering the plaque on Friday so that we would have it by Saturday for the funeral, okay? Or no, this was Thursday, wasn't it? It was Thursday, on Thursday. And so and I was just so grateful. They were going to mail it through UPS, but then because they were worried that it might not make it, they drove it from Marysville all the way to here and delivered it here. And this guy lived in Mukilteo, and he said, oh, I'll take it, it's close. So he gets here, and he looks over, and he's at us with this little Chevy S10 pickup truck and this big strap and this big tree, and he goes, you want some help with that? He did kind of talk like John Wayne. He really did. And so we said, yes. And so he says, move your truck. And so I move my little truck, and he pulls around with this great big truck it's got one of the trailer hitches that has like 4 different sizes of trailer hitch on it and everything. And he takes my little orange straps, and he ties them off to the tree, and he starts hauling them off. And he gets them all up into the north part. And then, just because he was all that, his truck won't get it completely off the pavement. And so he takes the strap himself, and he pulls these great big sections of tree that I know I couldn't move off. And Chris and I are just standing there going, wow. And Chris turns to me and he says, I think he's proud of his truck. And I think he was too. But here's the point, right? That morning I got a call from Steve Morrill of Morrill Foundries saying, we want to get it to you. We don't trust the UPS to get it there. I'm going to send one of my guys, right? And then we're out there with this crew that's been working for 24 hours straight, and they volunteer to chop up this big tree in the parking lot. And then this guy shows up with a truck that's actually capable of pulling the parts of that tree off of our parking lot. We started our service with prayers to light the candle, and I read, God comes to us through particular people in particular places and times, in the past and here and now. Our second candle reminds us to look for the light of God in God's messengers today. The light of God was in that orange-vested utility worker from Seattle City Light who just pulled out, and it was no big deal for him, chopped up that tree for us. And God's light was in that foundry worker who hooked up the sections of that tree to his great, big, beautiful truck and hauled them off of our parking lot for us. God is with us in the wilderness. And on our door there, over the door on your way out, it says to seek and serve Christ. It's to seek and serve Christ in all others, to see Christ in others. And we were blessed by these strangers who just showed up and helped us. That was thousands of dollars of work that they did for us, and probably many damaged muscles that they saved Chris and I by moving and chopping and doing all of that. That, for me, that was the truck and the canoe and the helicopter. God sent us people to bless us in the wilderness. Here we are in the wilderness, and God is with us. Our job is to both see Christ in others and let them help, like those 2 guys did, and it's to be that for others. We can be that light of Christ. We can be the one that, if you can help, do it. Help. That's what we're about. That's what it means to be followers of Jesus. And that's what I want to share with you from John the Baptist's confusing and difficult message in the wilderness. Thank you.